Imagine a courtroom showdown where a judge's disdain meets a seemingly ordinary teenager, and then, in a single moment, everything changes. What hidden secret could transform mockery into jaw-dropping revelation? Stay tuned as the story takes an unexpected twist that challenges every preconception and redefines the rules of justice. In a small, time-worn town called Cedar Falls, where faded sidewalks and creaking storefronts told stories of long-forgotten dreams, Thaddeus Quinlan quietly forged his own destiny. Every evening, as the dying light of day seeped through the narrow windows of the local library, Thaddeus would slip into a secluded corner and lose himself in a world of words and logic. Despite his young age, his mind was a repository of legal texts, court opinions, and complex philosophical treatises. He pored over battered law books with an intensity that set him apart from his peers, whose interests rarely ventured beyond the fleeting distractions of youth. For Thaddeus, each page was a window into a realm where justice reigned and every wrong had a remedy, a realm that offered hope in a life marred by hardship and misunderstanding. Thaddeus's journey had not been an easy one. Raised in a fractured home where the absence of stable guidance was as palpable as the chill in the winter air, he was no stranger to loss and neglect. His father had long since vanished into the shadows of a troubled past, leaving behind nothing but whispered regrets and a lingering sense of abandonment. His mother, though warm and caring in fleeting moments, was burdened by relentless struggles that ultimately left little room for nurturing a young mind brimming with potential. In this environment of silence and sorrow, Thaddeus found solace not in the company of others, but in the quiet consistency of the law. The library became his sanctuary, a haven where the dusty aroma of old books mixed with his fervent dreams of one day becoming an advocate for those who had been overlooked by society. Late at night, when the world outside was shrouded in darkness and the quiet murmur of the town had faded into stillness, Thaddeus would sit at a creaky wooden table, illuminated only by the flickering light of a second-hand desk lamp. There, amidst scribbled notes and yellowed pages, he would debate with himself, challenging the injustices he had witnessed and imagining a future where his voice could change lives. His eyes, dark and thoughtful, sparkled with a secret resolve as he crafted arguments and rehearsed courtroom speeches in the solitude of his mind. Every sentence he read, every legal principle he absorbed, was a stepping stone toward a destiny that defied the limitations imposed by his background. In those solitary hours, the weight of his past transformed into a driving force, urging him to rise above the ridicule and despair that had so often defined his early years. The streets of Cedar Falls, with their worn cobblestones and modest homes, whispered of a collective history marked by both resilience and resignation. In the midst of this ordinary backdrop, Thaddeus's ambition shone like a rare gem, small, precious, and fiercely determined. He was aware that his ideas, his relentless pursuit of knowledge, and his passion for justice might be misunderstood by a community that had long settled into a predictable rhythm of life. Yet, with every skeptical glance from classmates and every dismissive comment from those who could not see beyond his youthful exterior, Thaddeus's resolve only deepened. He began to understand that true genius often lay hidden beneath layers of hardship, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Each day, as he walked the uneven streets from school to the library, Thaddeus carried with him an unspoken promise, a vow to use his unique talents to fight for the voiceless. He saw in the injustices around him not just a personal burden, but an opportunity to redefine the meaning of fairness in a world that too often turned a blind eye to the suffering of its most vulnerable citizens. His mind became a quiet battleground where the ideals of law and order clashed with the chaotic realities of life. And though his journey was just beginning, every carefully written note and every intense study session was a testament to his belief that even a troubled past could give birth to a brilliant future. In this small town where hope was a scarce commodity, Thaddeus Quinlan began to weave together the threads of his own story, a narrative that promised not only redemption for himself but a beacon of hope for those who had long been silenced by despair. His early steps, measured and resolute, marked the start of an extraordinary journey. One that would eventually lead him to the very halls of justice, where his intellect and passion could transform the lives of others. And though the road ahead was uncertain and fraught with challenges, Thaddeus's unwavering determination ensured that every setback would serve as fuel for a future where truth, courage, and compassion prevailed over darkness. Late one rainy evening, as Thaddeus Quinlan trudged along the slick, glistening sidewalks of Cedar Falls after another long night at the library, he couldn't shake the feeling that fate was about to intervene. The steady patter of raindrops against his threadbare coat and the distant rumble of passing cars provided a somber symphony that matched the tumult in his heart. He had spent the day immersed in legal texts and fervently scribbling notes about cases of injustice, thoughts that, even now, lingered like embers in his mind. The chill in the air wasn't just from the rain, it was also the unmistakable sensation that something momentous was about to happen. As Thaddeus rounded a corner near an old brick building that had seen better days, he noticed a solitary figure huddled beneath a flickering street lamp. The woman, dressed in a worn but dignified coat and clutching an umbrella that barely shielded her from the downpour, seemed out of place amid the indifferent gloom. Her eyes, though tired, burned with a mix of urgency and sorrow. Unable to ignore the silent plea in her gaze, Thaddeus slowed his pace and approached her cautiously. "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice barely rising above the rhythmic drumming of the rain. "Are you all right?" The woman looked up, startled at first, then relaxed as she recognized the determined yet compassionate look in his eyes. "I'm sorry to trouble you, son," she began, her accent hinting at generations of heritage, "but I need someone who understands the law, someone who isn't afraid to stand up when injustice is at hand." Her name was Cordelia Underwood, a name that carried both antiquity and an air of authority. She explained in halting, trembling tones that a dear friend and respected pillar of the community, Mr. Lysander Beecham, was in dire straits. Cordelia detailed how Lysander, a modest shopkeeper known for his kindness and his unwavering honesty, had been targeted by a cadre of corrupt local officials. These men, driven by greed and political ambition, had concocted a scheme to extort money from Lysander under the guise of protecting his business from alleged threats. Over the past several months, they had increased their demands, exploiting every loophole in the system, and turning Lysander's once thriving business into a desperate financial quagmire. The officials' harassment had escalated to the point where Lysander was on the brink of losing not only his livelihood but also his dignity. Cordelia's voice wavered as she recounted the mounting evidence of bribery and intimidation, a series of secret memos, discreetly recorded phone conversations, and even whispered confessions from intimidated employees. The weight of the injustice was palpable in her words. "Mr. Beecham has always been the kind of man who stands for decency," she said, tears glistening in her eyes despite the cold drizzle. "But now, he's being crushed under the tyranny of those who should be protecting our community. I believe there's enough evidence hidden in plain sight, and I think you, Thaddeus, might be the only one who can see what others overlook." Thaddeus felt a shiver run down his spine, not from the cold, but from the stirring of something deep within him. He had long harbored a burning desire to challenge injustice, to become the advocate he'd envisioned during countless solitary nights spent poring over court decisions. Here was a real, living case that transcended the abstract theories he had studied so diligently. His mind raced as he considered the implications. This was not merely about one man's financial ruin, it was about a community betrayed by those in power, and it was a chance to channel his passion into something transformative. He listened intently as Cordelia continued, her words painting a picture of systemic corruption intertwined with personal ruin. She told him of secret meetings held in back rooms, of documents meticulously altered to serve a nefarious purpose, and of a mounting despair that had gripped Lysander's soul. "I've reached out to others," she confessed, "but none have the courage or the insight to take on these entrenched forces. I believe in you, Thaddeus, because I see in you a brilliance that can cut through the lies. Please, help us restore justice." For a long moment, Thaddeus stood in the rain, his heart pounding with a mix of apprehension and fierce determination. The weight of Cordelia's plea settled over him like a mantle. Here was a tangible challenge, a case that demanded not just legal acumen but a moral conviction that could spark change. He knew that stepping into this battle could mark the beginning of an arduous journey, one that might expose him to ridicule, personal risk, and even heartbreak. And yet, the promise of righting a grievous wrong was too powerful to ignore. With a firm nod and a quiet, resolute voice, Thaddeus accepted the challenge. "I'll do it," he said simply, meeting Cordelia's gaze. "I'll look into Mr. Beauchamp's case and see what can be done. You have my word that I won't let this injustice continue unchecked." In that rain-soaked moment, as the city's lights blurred into watery reflections on the pavement, Thaddeus Quinlan felt the first true stirrings of his destiny taking shape. The path ahead was uncertain, riddled with obstacles both seen and unseen, but he was ready to embark on the journey. Little did he know that this very case would not only test his burgeoning talent as a legal advocate but also set him on a collision course with the very institutions he had long vowed to challenge, a collision that would transform him from a misunderstood teenager into a formidable force for justice. Thaddeus returned home that rainy night with a storm of determination swirling inside him. The encounter with Cordelia Underwood had left an indelible mark on his soul, igniting a fire that would not be easily quenched. As he stepped into his cramped room, a modest space lined with second-hand books, scribbled notes, and dog-eared legal documents, he felt the weight of responsibility settle on his slender shoulders. The case of Mr. Lysander Beauchamp was more than just a legal challenge, it was a chance to prove that even a misunderstood teenager from Cedar Falls could stand up to entrenched corruption. The next morning, in the pale light of dawn, Thaddeus hurried to the Cedar Falls Public Library, the one sanctuary where he could escape the oppressive reality of his troubled home. He found a quiet corner behind rows of law books and began poring over city records, municipal reports, and archival newspapers. His fingers trembled slightly as he uncovered snippets of scandal, rumors of bribery, coercion, and an intricate network of deceit that had slowly strangled the local business community. Every page he turned seemed to whisper secrets of bureaucratic malfeasance, painting a picture of a system designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the innocent. Immersed in his research, Thaddeus spent long hours cross-referencing court cases and examining obscure precedents. He meticulously noted every detail that might help his case, scribbling down dates, names, and even the subtlest hints of motive. In his mind, every piece of evidence was a puzzle fragment, and slowly, he began to assemble a narrative that pointed to a deliberate abuse of power. The more he learned about the corrupt officials targeting Mr. Beauchamp, the more he realized that this was not an isolated incident, it was part of a larger pattern of exploitation that had silently eroded the fabric of his community. Determined to verify his findings, Thaddeus sought out the reluctant whispers of local informants. In the dim light of a rundown diner on the outskirts of town, he met with a former employee of the Beauchamp shop. The man's eyes darted nervously as he recounted tales of intimidation and manipulated ledgers, his voice barely rising above the hum of clattering dishes. "They'd come in, demand extra fees for permits that never existed, and if you didn't pay, they'd say your business was over," the man confided, glancing around as if expecting shadows to lurk in every corner. Thaddeus listened intently, his notebook filling with every carefully chosen word, every pause that betrayed deeper fear. The evidence was beginning to solidify into a damning portrait of systemic abuse. As days turned into nights, Thaddeus became a familiar face in the community, quietly asking questions in hushed tones at small-town gatherings, discreetly photographing documents and covertly making copies of official memos. His efforts were not without risk. He sometimes found himself looking over his shoulder in the rain-soaked streets, haunted by the possibility that those in power might notice his persistence. Yet, every time doubt crept into his mind, he recalled Cordelia's earnest plea and the desperate eyes of Lysander Beauchamp, and his resolve only hardened further. Amid his tireless investigations, Thaddeus began drafting a preliminary outline of his case. In long, carefully constructed paragraphs, he laid out the narrative of corruption, the economic strangulation of a once thriving business, and the human cost of such greed. His words were not just legal arguments, they were a passionate indictment of a system that had forsaken its duty to protect the vulnerable. Late one night, as a storm raged outside and lightning illuminated the silhouette of his cluttered desk, Thaddeus finally felt a spark of clarity. The evidence was mounting, the inconsistencies in the prosecution's narrative growing too glaring to ignore. Every document, every whispered confession he had gathered, coalesced into a vision of justice that was as breathtaking as it was daunting. In that solitary, rain-soaked hour, Thaddeus Quinlan transformed from a quiet dreamer into an unlikely advocate. His journey had taken him far from the comfort of dusty pages and familiar library corners, it had thrust him into the dangerous arena of public truth. He knew that the road ahead would be fraught with obstacles, ridicule, legal maneuvering, and perhaps even personal peril, but he also knew that this was his moment to rise. The injustices he had studied for so long were no longer abstract theories confined to books, they were real lives in peril, and he was determined to be their voice. With his mind abuzz and his heart set aflame by the cause, Thaddeus carefully gathered his notes and prepared to meet with Cordelia Underwood once again. He would present her with the evidence he had painstakingly assembled, confident that together they could forge a case powerful enough to challenge the corrupt forces that had so long held Cedar Falls in their grip. In that quiet library, surrounded by the echoes of history and the promise of a better future, Thaddeus took his first bold steps on the long, arduous path toward becoming the defender of justice he always knew he could be. The day of the trial dawned gray and foreboding, the overcast sky mirroring the apprehension that churned within Thaddeus as he stepped into the solemn corridors of Cedar Falls Municipal Court. Every step he took seemed to echo the weight of his newfound responsibility, and his heart pounded with the mingled fear and determination of a youth who was about to confront forces far larger than himself. In the polished yet austere courtroom, sunlight filtered weakly through tall windows, casting long, uneven shadows on rows of wooden benches that had borne witness to countless disputes over the years. Today, however, they were to witness something entirely unexpected. Thaddeus sat at the defense table beside his client, Mr. Lysander Beecham, a humble, weathered man whose eyes betrayed years of quiet suffering under the relentless siege of corruption. Clad in a modest but carefully pressed suit that barely masked the tremor in his hands, Thaddeus prepared to deliver an opening statement that would lay bare the systemic abuse that had reduced a once respected pillar of the community to a state of helpless despair. The murmurs of the courtroom gradually subsided as the presiding judge, Judge Marigold Radcliffe, took her seat upon the raised bench. Her presence was formidable, a mixture of ironclad authority and a reputation for an unwavering commitment to legal tradition. Yet, as her steely gaze swept across the courtroom, it landed on Thaddeus with a hint of scorn, as if to remind him that his youth rendered him unworthy of challenging established power. Without a moment's hesitation, Judge Radcliffe's voice rang out sharply, dripping with condescension. "Mr. Quinlan," she declared, her tone deliberately clipped, "I trust you understand that this court is not a venue for the fanciful notions of an inexperienced amateur. You stand here to represent Mr. Beecham, a man whose very name has been sullied by the actions of those who abuse their power, yet you, a mere teenager, presume to unravel complexities far beyond your years." The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence, punctuated only by the rustle of paper and the shifting of chairs. Even the gallery, filled with local citizens and reporters, seemed to hold its collective breath. For a long, suspended moment, Thaddeus allowed the judge's mockery to echo in his mind, a bitter reminder of the doubts that had dogged him throughout his solitary studies and whispered jeers in the halls of Cedar Falls High School. But then, with a measured calm that belied the storm inside him, he rose to his feet. His voice, initially soft and tentative, grew steadily in volume and confidence as he began his opening statement. "Your Honor," he started, "I stand before you not as an inexperienced amateur, but as a defender of truth and justice, ideals that have been neglected for far too long in our community." His words, carefully chosen and infused with genuine passion, reverberated around the room. Every syllable was a declaration of defiance against a system that had long turned a blind eye to injustice. Thaddeus unfolded the narrative of Mr. Beauchamp's plight with surgical precision, presenting a series of meticulously gathered documents, internal memos, manipulated financial records, and testimonies from frightened witnesses, each piece reinforcing the claim of deliberate extortion and corruption. As he spoke, his clear, logical arguments began to cut through the thick atmosphere of skepticism that had initially shrouded the proceedings. Even members of the jury, whose expressions had once been guarded, now leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the young advocate as if they were witnessing a revelation. The judge's earlier mockery seemed to falter in the face of such unwavering conviction. Though Judge Radcliffe maintained a stoic exterior, there was a subtle shift in her gaze, a flicker of reluctant acknowledgement that the arguments being presented were not the ramblings of an overzealous youth, but a well-constructed case built upon undeniable evidence. In between the measured cadences of Thaddeus's speech, he interspersed poignant remarks about the human cost of corruption. He recalled the hardships endured by Mr. Beecham, a man whose life had been eroded by systemic abuse, and the silent suffering of an entire community held hostage by greed and indifference. Thaddeus's narrative transcended the mere recitation of facts. It was an impassioned plea for dignity, for fairness, and for the restoration of a sense of justice that had been eroded by years of complacency. As he spoke, the room seemed to transform from an arena of scorn to a space where truth was allowed to shine through, however faintly at first. Despite the judge's initial scorn and the hardened attitudes of some in the gallery, Thaddeus's performance gradually won over even the most skeptical onlookers. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted imperceptibly, from one of derision to one of cautious respect. In that charged moment, the battle was no longer just a legal contest, but a moral crusade against the forces that had long subjugated the powerless. Thaddeus's calm, eloquent delivery, combined with the undeniable weight of his evidence, cast a long shadow over the earlier mockery. Even Judge Radcliffe, whose reputation for unyielding formality was well known, could no longer hide the flicker of surprise and a grudging admiration as she listened. The opening statement concluded not with a flourish of dramatic rhetoric but with a steady, heartfelt appeal. Today, we have the opportunity to restore not only a man's dignity but also the hope of a community that has suffered in silence. I ask you, Your Honor, to consider not just the law, but the spirit of justice that calls us all to protect the innocent and to hold the corrupt accountable. As his final words echoed through the now hushed courtroom, a palpable sense of possibility took hold. In that moment, the mockery had been transformed into a challenge that Thaddeus had met with a brilliance and maturity that promised to reshape not only the fate of Mr. Beecham but also the very future of justice in Cedar Falls. In the midst of the heated courtroom battle, the tension reached a fever pitch as the opposing counsel, a seasoned attorney with decades of experience, launched into an aggressive line of questioning aimed at dismantling Thaddeus's arguments. The air grew heavy with skepticism as the prosecutor recounted the standard narrative that had been fed to the court for months, an account that painted Mr. Beecham as a victim of circumstance rather than the target of a calculated scheme. Yet, as the prosecutor's words flowed, Thaddeus remained composed, his eyes never wavering from the gathered faces in the room. He could feel the weight of every skeptical gaze and every whispered doubt, and he knew that his next move had to be nothing short of brilliant. Drawing a deep breath, Thaddeus reached into his neatly organized briefcase and slowly withdrew a thick folder of meticulously gathered documents. With deliberate calm, he placed the folder on the defense table, allowing the stack of papers to catch the light, a silent, yet powerful, declaration of evidence that could no longer be ignored. The folder contained internal memos from the city council, financial ledgers riddled with discrepancies, and confidential emails exchanged among high-ranking officials. Each document had been cross-referenced with public records and meticulously annotated with dates, names, and explanations that exposed a systematic pattern of bribery and coercion. Your Honor, Thaddeus began, his voice steady but resonant in the hushed courtroom, I would like to present for the court's consideration a series of documents that incontrovertibly demonstrate that Mr. Beauchamp's business was subjected to extortion and manipulation by public officials. His words, clear and deliberate, cut through the murmur of disapproval that had once threatened to overwhelm his earlier statements. With slow, deliberate motions, he distributed copies of the documents to the judge, the jury, and even to the opposing counsel, whose confident facade wavered for the first time as he leafed through the papers. As Thaddeus stepped back, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted dramatically. A hush fell over the room as the evidence was scrutinized. The internal memos revealed, in stark detail, a series of transactions and directives that left little room for interpretation, each piece of evidence pointed directly to a collusion designed to force Mr. Beecham into submission. A particularly damning email, time-stamped in the early hours of a fateful night, showed a city official instructing an employee to adjust records in exchange for a substantial sum of money, a sum that had been inexplicably funneled into an account tied to Mr. Beauchamp's business. The clarity and precision of the language in these communications were undeniable. A murmur of astonishment rippled through the gallery. Even members of the jury, who had previously appeared indifferent, now leaned forward in their seats, eyes wide with recognition of the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Judge Marigold Radcliffe, who had so early in the trial dismissed Thaddeus with biting sarcasm, now examined the evidence with a more measured, if reluctant, respect. The opposing counsel struggled visibly to regain his footing, his earlier confidence shaken by the methodical presentation of facts that left no room for the arguments he had so confidently wielded just moments before. Thaddeus continued, his tone shifting from one of measured clarity to a passionate plea for justice. These documents are not merely records of transactions, they are the heartbeat of a system that has been corrupted by greed and indifference. They demonstrate that Mr. Beecham, a man known in our community for his integrity, has been targeted by those who would use their power for personal gain. I urge you all to look beyond the facade of bureaucratic procedure and see the human cost of this injustice. As his words sank in, the courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. A young witness, previously silent and trembling behind the witness stand, began to speak. In a voice that wavered but grew stronger with each sentence, the witness recounted how he had overheard heated conversations among city officials, conversations that hinted at secret meetings and illicit deals. His testimony corroborated the narrative laid out in Thaddeus's documents, providing a human face to the cold, hard evidence. With every detail, the witness's account lent further credence to the notion that this case was not an isolated incident, but rather a symptom of a deeply entrenched corruption that had permeated the corridors of power in Cedar Falls. By the time Thaddeus concluded his presentation, the courtroom had transformed from a chamber of derision into a forum of charged expectancy. The opposing counsel's attempts to deflect the mounting evidence fell flat, and even Judge Radcliffe's stern exterior could no longer hide the flicker of surprise and contemplation in her eyes. In that moment, Thaddeus's meticulous preparation and innate legal acumen had not only silenced his critics but had ignited a spark of hope among those who believed that justice could, in fact, prevail against overwhelming odds. The silence that followed was profound, a silence filled with the weight of truth and the promise of a turning tide. Thaddeus, standing resolute at the defense table, felt a surge of quiet triumph. He had taken the raw material of corruption and, through determination and intellect, had fashioned it into an undeniable case for justice. Though the path ahead was still uncertain, the brilliance of his evidence had shifted the momentum in favor of truth. And as whispers of admiration began to circulate through the room, it was clear that the seeds of change had been sown in that very courtroom, a change that would resonate far beyond the confines of this single trial. The courtroom's atmosphere transformed almost imperceptibly after Thaddeus finished presenting his damning evidence. The once dismissive murmur of skepticism that had permeated the room was replaced by a charged silence, a collective intake of breath as the magnitude of the revelation sank in. Jurors exchanged glances, even those who had worn expressions of aloof detachment now leaned forward in their seats, eyes fixed on the table where the documents lay spread out like a tapestry of deceit. The opposing counsel fumbled with his notes, his confident demeanor crumbling under the weight of incontrovertible facts. A palpable tension filled the room as Judge Radcliffe shifted in her seat, her eyes narrowing as she studied the evidence. The judge's once impenetrable facade of authority now revealed hints of internal conflict. Her gavel, which had earlier signified an unyielding grip on the courtroom, now rested quietly on her desk as if she were momentarily uncertain of how to proceed in the face of such clarity. In that moment, the trial was no longer simply about defending a beleaguered businessman. It had become a battle for the soul of the community, exposing the underbelly of systemic corruption that had quietly strangled the town for far too long. Then, the murmur of hushed voices gave way to a single, trembling sound, a call to the witness stand. A timid figure, previously unseen by most, was ushered forward. The man, a former clerk at the city council office, had been one of the few who had risked speaking out against the conspiracies that had ensnared Mr. Beecham. His hands shook as he clutched a worn folder, his eyes darting nervously between Thaddeus and Judge Radcliffe. As he took the oath, his voice quavered at first, but as he began to recount the details of his experiences, the secret meetings in poorly lit back rooms, the hushed instructions to falsify records, the cold indifference with which his warnings were met, his tone gradually grew steadier, more resolute. His testimony was raw and personal, a window into the corruption that had plagued Cedar Falls. Every word he spoke resonated with the weight of lived experience, and even the jurors could not help but be moved by the truth in his account. As the witness detailed the covert exchanges between city officials and unscrupulous businessmen, Thaddeus interjected occasionally with pointed questions that drove the narrative deeper into the murk of corruption. The synergy between the young attorney's relentless questioning and the witness's unburdening confession created a moment of dramatic clarity. The prosecution's earlier narrative, meticulously crafted to portray Mr. Beecham as a hapless victim of circumstance, began to crumble. Each piece of evidence, each corroborated detail from the witness's testimony, chipped away at the carefully constructed facade of innocence that the corrupt powers had erected. In one particularly powerful moment, the witness recalled a specific night when an official, his voice barely above a whisper, had explicitly stated that no one should expect mercy when profit is at stake. The starkness of that memory, delivered in a tone laden with regret and fear, sent a ripple of shock through the courtroom. Even Judge Radcliffe's eyes betrayed a glimmer of discomfort as she absorbed the magnitude of such blatant abuse of power. The gallery, filled with local citizens who had long suffered in silence, erupted in soft murmurs of outrage and solidarity. Thaddeus continued his cross-examination with the precision of a seasoned advocate. He methodically questioned inconsistencies, pressed the witness for further details, and laid bare the links between the tampered records and the sudden financial downturn in Mr. Beauchamp's business. Every answer from the witness, every tearful pause and trembling admission, served to bolster Thaddeus's case. The meticulously prepared arguments that had flowed from his lips earlier now found their perfect complement in the unvarnished truth of the witness's account. At one point, a juror's expression shifted from guarded skepticism to open empathy, as the weight of the testimony sank in. Across the room, even members of the prosecution's team exchanged anxious looks, realizing that the case was tilting irrevocably in favor of justice. Thaddeus's presentation of evidence had become a rallying cry, a call for accountability that transcended the confines of the courtroom and spoke directly to the hearts of the people who had long been marginalized by systemic injustice. As the witness concluded his testimony, the silence in the room was overwhelming. The prosecution scrambled to regain control, but their words now seemed hollow in comparison to the undeniable truth that had been laid bare. Judge Radcliffe, momentarily subdued by the force of the revelations, finally spoke. Her voice, measured and deliberate, acknowledged the weight of the evidence and the sincerity of the witness's testimony. She instructed the court to take a brief recess, allowing the jurors time to absorb the overwhelming barrage of facts and emotions that had reshaped the entire trial. During the recess, whispers filled the corridors outside the courtroom. The local media, sensing the shifting tide, buzzed with excitement and speculation. Community members who had come to witness the trial for its dramatic narrative now found themselves contemplating the deeper implications of a system that had allowed such corruption to fester. Thaddeus, standing quietly at the edge of the gallery, felt a surge of both relief and cautious optimism. He knew that the turning point of the trial had been reached. Not only had the truth emerged, but it had done so with a force that could not be ignored. In that charged pause, between the conclusion of the witness's testimony and the resumption of the trial, Thaddeus's mind raced with the possibilities of what could come next. He was aware that his journey was far from over, that the battle against entrenched corruption would be long and arduous. Yet, in that moment of collective introspection, as the courtroom held its breath and the future of Mr. Beauchamp's fate hung in the balance, Thaddeus Quinlan felt a profound certainty. He had ignited a spark of change, one that might very well redefine justice in Cedar Falls. And as the gavel prepared to fall once more, he steeled himself for the next act in a trial that had already transformed from a mere legal proceeding into a crusade for truth and dignity. After the recess, as the courtroom settled into a tense calm once again, Thaddeus Quinlan returned to his seat with the steely determination of a young man who knew that everything now hinged on his final words. The atmosphere in the room was almost palpable, a mixture of anticipation, subdued hope, and a lingering sense of awe that had begun to replace the earlier skepticism. As the proceedings resumed, Judge Marigold Radcliffe signaled for the defense to present their closing argument, and all eyes turned toward Thaddeus. Clearing his throat, Thaddeus rose and slowly walked to the center of the courtroom. His eyes swept over the assembled jury and spectators, each face reflecting a spectrum of emotions, from hardened doubt to tentative belief. Taking a deep, steadying breath, he began to speak in a calm yet impassioned tone. "Your Honor, esteemed members of the jury, today we stand at the crossroads of justice and indifference. We have witnessed evidence that exposes not merely an isolated act of extortion but a pattern of corruption that has long tainted the very institutions meant to protect our community." Thaddeus's voice resonated with a blend of logical precision and heartfelt urgency. He meticulously recounted the chain of evidence he had presented earlier, documents that left no doubt about the clandestine collusion between powerful officials and those who had exploited Mr. Beecham. His narrative wove together the stark facts with a personal plea. He spoke of the human cost behind every manipulated ledger and every suppressed testimony. With every word, he transformed the cold technicalities of legal evidence into a vivid tapestry of injustice, pain, and the urgent need for reform. In a measured cadence that allowed each syllable to sink in, Thaddeus challenged the prosecution's narrative. He pointed out inconsistencies and deliberate omissions in their account, questioning why the system would allow such a blatant abuse of power to persist. "It is not enough," he declared, his voice growing in intensity, "to merely note that Mr. Beecham suffered. We must ask ourselves, what does it say about our society if those entrusted with power can act with impunity, if the innocent continue to pay the price for the greed of the corrupt?" A hush fell over the courtroom as Thaddeus paused, letting the gravity of his words settle in. For a brief moment, the only sound was the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the soft rustle of papers on the desk. Then, drawing upon a personal recollection that had shaped his own resolve, he spoke of his childhood, a time when he, too, had been dismissed and mocked for daring to dream of a fairer world. He shared how the sting of ridicule had fueled his determination to become a voice for those who had long been silenced. His confession was both raw and eloquent, a testament to the fact that his fight was not merely legal, but deeply personal. As his closing argument reached its zenith, Thaddeus's words coalesced into a stirring call to action. He urged the jury and everyone present to see beyond the layers of bureaucracy and cynicism, to recognize that the pursuit of truth was a sacred duty, a duty that transcended the boundaries of age, experience, or social standing. "Let this trial be a beacon," he implored, "a turning point where we declare that no individual, regardless of their status or background, shall be condemned by the silence of our institutions. Today, we have the power to reshape not only a single life but the very future of our community." A charged silence followed his final sentence, a silence so profound that it seemed to reverberate off the walls of the courtroom. In that suspended moment, even Judge Radcliffe's previously steely expression softened, betraying the impact of Thaddeus's words. Members of the jury exchanged glances, and a few spectators, moved by the passion and clarity of the young advocate's speech, nodded in quiet agreement. Finally, the judge's gavel fell with a measured strike, signaling a brief recess to allow the court to deliberate. As the room slowly emptied, murmurs of admiration and cautious optimism filled the corridors. Thaddeus, still standing near the defense table, felt the weight of what he had just delivered, a message of hope and resilience that had pierced through decades of institutional complacency. Outside, in the cool light of a late afternoon, whispers of change stirred in the community. Reporters and local citizens, who had gathered outside the courthouse, sensed that something extraordinary was unfolding within those walls. And as Thaddeus quietly rejoined his mentor, Cordelia Underwood, the young advocate knew that regardless of the final verdict, the seeds of justice had been sown, seeds that, nurtured by truth and courage, could one day grow into a future where every voice was valued and every injustice met with unwavering resolve. After what felt like an eternity of hushed deliberation and palpable tension, the courtroom doors swung open, and the presiding judge re-entered with a solemn air. The once tense atmosphere had shifted into a suspended quiet, every person in the room holding their breath in anticipation. Judge Marigold Radcliffe, her expression softened and reflective, took her seat once again. In a measured, deliberate tone that contrasted sharply with her earlier scorn, she announced the verdict: Mr. Lysander Beecham was exonerated, and the corrupt practices that had plagued Cedar Falls would now be subjected to a thorough investigation and sweeping reform. A murmur of relief and subdued jubilation rippled through the room as the weight of injustice finally began to lift. Thaddeus Quinlan sat at the defense table, his hands trembling ever so slightly, not from fear now, but from a surge of vindication and hope. In that moment, as the final words echoed across the silent courtroom, his journey from an overlooked, troubled teenager to a formidable voice for justice was validated. The evidence he had painstakingly compiled, the countless hours spent in the library poring over records and statutes, and the relentless pursuit of truth had culminated in this singular triumph. The jury's unanimous decision was not merely a legal victory, it was a beacon of change that promised to restore dignity to a man wronged by a corrupt system and to ignite long-overdue reforms in the community. Judge Radcliffe, her tone subdued and almost contrite, took a brief pause before addressing the courtroom. Today, we have witnessed the power of truth and the resilience of the human spirit. I must acknowledge that the perspectives presented by Mr. Quinlan were not those of a mere amateur, but of an advocate whose insight and determination have far exceeded expectations. In that rare moment of candor, she offered him a nod that conveyed both recognition and an unspoken apology, a transformation from the mockery of the early proceedings to genuine admiration. Reporters in the gallery quickly captured the scene, a young attorney, no older than a high school senior, standing as a testament to the possibility of redemption and reform. Outside the courthouse, a palpable sense of renewal had taken hold of Cedar Falls. Neighbors, who had once lived in resigned silence under the weight of systemic corruption, emerged onto the streets to share quiet words of hope and relief. Local community leaders began organizing meetings to address the long-standing grievances that the trial had so starkly brought to light. Thaddeus's mentor, Cordelia Underwood, embraced him warmly in the bustling foyer as members of the community offered their congratulations. In hushed conversations, people spoke of a future where integrity would once again be valued over greed, and where even the most marginalized voices would be heard. In the days that followed, Thaddeus found himself inundated with unexpected opportunities. A prestigious law school, impressed by his performance in court and the clarity of his vision, extended a full scholarship offer. Local organizations invited him to speak at community forums, where his eloquent testimony inspired others to stand up against injustice. Even those who had once dismissed him as a naive teenager now recognized him as a prodigy, a brilliant mind forged in the crucible of hardship and determination. His days became a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and collaborative efforts to bring about the reforms that the trial had ignited. At home, Thaddeus would often sit by his window in the quiet hours of early evening, looking out over the town that had once seemed so indifferent. He reflected on how the echoes of his childhood struggles had transformed into a force for change. Each new day, he carried the lessons learned from his past, the isolation, the ridicule, the quiet nights filled with self-doubt, and turned them into the fuel for his future. In his journal, he wrote about the importance of resilience and the belief that even the most seemingly insurmountable obstacles could be overcome when one dared to seek truth. For Mr. Beecham, the verdict was a turning point. The exoneration not only restored his reputation but also signified a rebirth of his business and, with it, the hope for a community that had long suffered under the weight of corruption. In quiet gratitude, he visited Thaddeus and Cordelia at the library where it all began, leaving behind a signed copy of an old legal text, a token of respect and a symbol of the new era dawning in Cedar Falls. In the final hours of that transformative day, as twilight painted the sky in hues of lavender and gold, Thaddeus stepped outside the courthouse. The cool breeze carried with it the promise of change, and the distant sound of lively conversation from the assembled townspeople filled him with a profound sense of purpose. Looking upward, he silently vowed to continue his fight for justice, not just for Mr. Beecham but for every soul affected by the pervasive corruption of the past. In that moment, the young attorney understood that his journey was only beginning, a journey marked by challenges, yes, but also by the unyielding belief that truth, when championed with courage, could reshape the world. And so, with a steady gaze and a heart full of hope, Thaddeus Quinlan embraced the future, a future where the light of justice would never again be dimmed by the shadows of neglect and greed. From my perspective, the ending of this story is a brilliant testament to the transformative power of resilience and truth. It isn't just a legal victory for Mr. Beecham, nor is it solely a personal triumph for Thaddeus Quinlan, it's a watershed moment that illuminates the possibility of genuine change in even the most entrenched systems of corruption. The way the courtroom shifts from mockery and skepticism to a collective recognition of justice being served is profoundly moving. It suggests that when courageous individuals dare to challenge the status quo with unwavering integrity and intellect, they can spark a ripple effect that transforms not only a single case but an entire community. For me, this ending encapsulates the idea that redemption is always within reach, no matter how deeply the wounds of injustice have been inflicted. Thaddeus's journey, from an overlooked, misunderstood teenager to a formidable voice for justice, serves as a powerful reminder that brilliance and determination can emerge from the most unexpected places. Ultimately, the story leaves us with a message of hope, that every act of courage, every step toward uncovering the truth, carries the potential to redefine our future for the better.